is the respiratory system. So remember that you have two canals by which air can go into your respiratory system. You have your nose and your mouth, and the nasal and oral canals. Then you have cavities, oral cavity and nasal cavity and oral cavity. When you start going down right over here, you've got your throat or your pharynx. Okay, you're also going to have this little flappy region right over here. If you recall, that's called the epiglottis, and that's going to close every time that you eat, so that food goes right down your esophagus into your digestive system, which is not pictured here, but it would be right in the back over here. And not actually go into your respiratory system, into your lungs. So that's why you can't actually breathe while you're swallowing, because of the fact that this epiglottis, this flap thing here, is closed. Besides that, right here, close to the epiglottis, you have your vocal cords, and you also have your voice box, which is called the larynx, if you guys recall. Down here you have your trachea. These are your bronchi, okay? They're the ones that start dividing the trachea into two. After them, you've got your bronchioles, these little tiny tree-like branches, and these tiny yellow circles are your alveoli, which are those air sacs that you've already learned about. You should know what this is as well. This is your diaphragm, that muscle that allows the lungs to expand or contract. You should also know that right over here you have another set of muscles, and they're the muscles in between your ribs, your intercostal muscles. They're also going to contract or relax in order to move those lungs and change the pressure. Okay, so if you talk about breathing in and breathing out, you're talking about inhaling and exhaling. Okay, so this is an image of your lungs. Okay, so what you can see here is that the minute that you're inhaling, what you're doing, or what the muscles are doing, is that they're making space in that lung. They're expanding the lung so that there is more space. When there is more space, then the air pressure is going to drop. The reason why the air pressure is going to drop is because if the volume is larger, sorry, that is my cat. If the volume is larger for the same amount of molecules, then the molecules have more space to collide, okay? And that means that pressure is lower. What's actually going to happen is that since here now we have more space, molecules from the outside, like air molecules, which can be nitrogen or oxygen, are going to start migrating inside the lungs, because they're moving from a higher concentration to an area where there is less of them, okay? If you recall, this can be the idea of movement from higher pressure to lower pressure, but it can also be an idea very similar to diffusion, movement from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So it's not actually that when you're breathing, you're forcing air in. What you're doing is that you're expanding your lungs, making the volumes of the lungs increase, and by doing that, you are dropping the pressure. You're decreasing the pressure in those lungs. And since air is going to move from an area of higher pressure on the outside to lower pressure on the inside, air automatically comes in an inhalation. So how do we expand the volume? How do we increase the volume of the lungs? Well, we can use this very useful muscle right over here, and we can use the muscles that are very useful over here as well, that are right in between the ribs. What the intercostal muscles are going to do, which are the muscles in between the ribs, they're going to contract. And when they're going to contract, they're going to pull the ribs outward. Okay? When they pull the ribs outward, they inflate the lungs. At the same time, this diaphragm is going to contract. The normal relaxed state of the diaphragm looks like a very deep sea, like this. It is very folded. When it actually contracts is when it pulls downwards. When it's pulling downwards, it pulls with it the lungs, inflates the volume of the lungs, decreases the pressure, and allows air to migrate inside. Exhaling is the opposite. Everything goes back to its relaxed state. the intercostal muscles, which are the muscles right over here in between the ribs, are going to relax. That means that they're going to be in their original state, which is not pointing outwards. It's just relaxed. Okay? And the diaphragm also relaxes, which means it's going to be in its original state, which is a very curved state. All of this together means that the lungs are going to have less volume. If the lungs have less volume, the pressure inside the lungs is higher. When the pressure inside the lungs is higher, the air inside the lung is going to want to migrate to areas of lower pressure, which in this case is outside the lungs. That is going to be exhaling. Okay, this is another image, just a side image of the process, inhaling and exhaling. This is your diaphragm when it is contracted or pulled downwards. This is your diaphragm when it is relaxed or pulled upwards. Remember that it takes energy, it takes ATP to pull this diaphragm downwards. But just like a rubber band, to pull it upwards doesn't actually take ATP. What it takes is potential energy, just this potential elastic energy that allows this diaphragm, that in the metaphor of a rubber band would simply snap right back to its original position. Okay, so let's look at the breathing process. First, when you inhale, you breathe air into your lungs, your rib muscles and diaphragms will contract. The diaphragm will move downwards and ribs are pulled upwards and outwards, increasing the volume of your lungs. This action expands the chest cavity, the entire thorax, creating lower pressure in the lungs. Air rushes into the lungs because of this idea of air pressure moving from higher pressure to lower pressure. And when you exhale, you release air from your lungs because the reverse thing is happening. How does the exchange of gas occur in the lungs? You've also talked about this a little bit and seen this in videos. Oxygen is going to bind to hemoglobin, that is a protein molecule that is found in the red blood cells, and CO2 will be released. Hemoglobin is the protein molecule that actually exchanges oxygen and CO2, so it deals with both things. Okay, the concentration of CO2 is high in your pulmonary capillary. So in the capillaries, remember these are blood vessels that are close to these alveoli, these little air sacs in the lungs, is going to be super high with CO2. Since the concentration of CO2 is going to be higher in the capillaries than in the alveoli, CO2 is going to migrate from the capillaries into the alveoli just based on diffusion. Remember, diffusion is the movement of particles from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. Okay? This exchange is going to occur super rapidly, so this happens in a fraction of seconds. That's why this keeps you alive. CO2 then leaves the alveoli when you exhale, and oxygen enters the alveoli when you inhale. Okay? So if we want to see it in this way, this is kind of what the alveoli look like. These are little tiny air sacs right at the end of each bronchiole. Okay, and it has this connection to these capillaries. So the capillaries that is taking blood towards the alveoli are going to be super low in oxygen and super rich in CO2. Since there's so much CO2 in these capillaries, it's going to migrate into this alveoli. And as it migrates into these air sacs, when you exhale, it's going to be transported out of your body with that exhalation. The opposite is going to be true with the capillaries that are taking blood away from your lungs. So these are the capillaries that are taking blood away from the lungs. They're not going towards the alveoli, they're going away from the alveoli. And what happens is that every time you inhale, the alveoli are going to fill up with oxygen. Oxygen is going to be in super high concentrations here, and it's going to diffuse into, right over here actually, it's going to diffuse into these capillaries that do not contain oxygen or contain very little oxygen, oxygenating these capillaries and allowing them to take that oxygen into the blood and transporting it back into the entire body. What we can talk about right now is what actually regulates how fast we do this, because this breathing, inhalation and exhalation, and this exchange of CO2 and oxygen can occur at different rates. And you can notice this whenever you are very calm, you're breathing super slowly. And when you're stressed out or you're anxious or you're scared, you start breathing super fast. You also start breathing super fast when you start doing exercise. So there's a reason why the rate of breathing changes. So it's not actually, a lot of people believe that breathing rate is regulated or is affected by the amount of oxygen, right? And it makes sense, because you need oxygen to survive. You need oxygen to be transported to your cells so that your cells can use it in cellular respiration. And whenever you're breathing super fast, like when you're doing exercise, it makes sense that oxygen would control your breathing rate, because since you're doing exercise, your cells need more oxygen because they need more energy. They need to produce more energy. So a lot of people think that it's oxygen, but it's actually not oxygen, and that's super important. We need to know that breathing rate is not controlled by oxygen, but it's controlled by CO2. Okay, carbon dioxide, the amount of carbon dioxide in your blood is actually what controls your rate of breathing. Okay, and we're gonna hopefully talk about this soon. This is called the bicarbonate buffer system. I'll tell you later on why this regulation of breathing based on CO2 is called the bicarbonate buffer system. So what actually happens, if we can skip to a next image, what actually happens is that, let's say that you're exercising. So during exercise, your cell metabolism increases and produces more CO2. That means that each cell is creating more ATP, and to create more ATP, they're using more oxygen and they're producing as a waste product more CO2. So they're filling up your blood with a whole bunch of CO2. That's a little bit of a problem, because CO2, carbon dioxide, actually dissolves in blood. When it dissolves in blood, and the reason why it dissolves in blood, remember that blood has a lot of water. Okay, so this water joins with CO2 and actually forms a molecule called carbonic acid. Very important word, acid. Okay, when you're talking about something that's acidic, hopefully you know this, as acid it can change your pH scale. So hopefully you know that the pH scale, and that the pH scale is a number from 0 to 14. If it is less than 7, it is acidic. If it is more than 7, it is basic. Okay, so since you are forming this carbonic acid, you're forming an acid in your blood, you're lowering your pH. Okay, you cannot lower your pH in your blood. It's actually super deadly to lower pH in blood. So what happens when the blood starts becoming more acidic? That actually sends a message to your brain. Okay, specifically a very important section in the brain, and we're going to see what that section is in a second. You send that message to the brain, and the receptors in the brain that are picking up on that drop in pH or that acidity are going to send nerve signals to increase your breathing rate. Why would we increase our breathing rate? We're going to increase our breathing rate because we do not want all of the CO2 dissolved in our blood creating carbonic acid. So what do we want to do with it? We want to exhale it out. We want to simply breathe it out, okay, through an exhalation. But since we have so much CO2, what can we do? We can increase our breathing rate. We can increase the number of times we exhale per minute, so that we can remove as much CO2 from the blood as we can. In this way, restoring the normal pH of our blood. Okay, so the idea is, produce too much CO2, CO2 becomes carbonic acid. Carbonic acid tells your brain, come on, you need to fix this because it's not good to have acid in the blood. So breathing rate increases. More number of exhalations per minute means you get rid of more CO2, and you have reached homeostasis. Remember, homeostasis is the balance in your body. So you have reached a balance of CO2 level in the body. Since you're creating more CO2, you're also breathing faster to get rid of that CO2. Okay, so that's pretty much what this says. Breathing rate is controlled by amount of CO2. When CO2 is produced by cellular respiration in tissues, it diffuses into the capillaries and dissolves in the plasma of the blood. Remember, plasma of the blood is mainly water. When it does this, it creates this compound, carbonic acid. This is the molecular formula of carbonic acid. The increase in this acid causes a drop in pH. This signals this part of the brain. So go ahead and write this down somewhere. The part of the brain is called the medulla oblongata. Okay? And this is the part of the brain that actually sends those signals to increase breathing rate. Okay? When you increase breathing rate, what you do is that all of the carbonic acid that was formed is going to break down. So it's going to be reversed. It's going to break down into CO2 and H2O. H2O becomes part of the plasma. CO2 diffuses into the alveoli and is simply exhaled out. Okay, so hopefully that makes a lot of sense. Go right ahead now and go into your Schoology and complete the question sets that I have assigned for you. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Write it down in the discussion board for student questions or concerns, or send me a Schoology message. Thank you very much.